there was one headline that was particularly painful, which had a photo of me outside Downing Street, which I'd been for some sort of government meeting. And it was from Downing Street to Down and Out.
Today's guest, Gavin Patterson, ran one of the UK's most complex FTSE 100 businesses for 6 years before crossing to the other side of the table to become one of the most active board chairs in UK tech.
As a CEO, you're surrounded by advice, consultants, investment bankers, lawyers, media advisors.
None of them have been in the arena themselves offering advice.
And in truth, all of them have an agenda.
He took BT through a £15 billion acquisition, the structural separation of Openreach and the launch of BT Sport. After 4 years growing Salesforce's revenues from $19 billion to $30 billion as President and Chief Revenue Officer, he left in 2023 and has since built a portfolio.
If you begin to confuse your own brilliance with actually benefiting from a tailwind or a lucky intervention, you begin to lose touch with reality.
Welcome to Enter the Boardroom, the podcast for boards and board members. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Neural, home to the Enter the Boardroom community, the destination for serving and aspiring board directors. Gavin, welcome to Enter the Boardroom.
Delighted to be here, Ollie.
Gavin, I'd like to start by talking about some of the formative moments from your executive career. Now, most CEOs of major businesses will point to the big strategic calls as their formative moments. I'd like to go somewhere different and to ask you to think of a moment where your relationship with your board or a specific board member fundamentally changed how you thought about your job as CEO.
I think this is a particularly interesting question. I'm not sure it's one moment in particular. I think it was when I became a member, a NED on another board or a series of other boards. And I was able to appreciate the role of a NED from that perspective. And it allowed me to sort of go back to my day job, if you like, as a CEO and think about things differently from that perspective. I think, until then, I'd been in a position where I thought about the job as a CEO as almost like any other job. My job was to present the plan as a finished article and get people's agreement to it. And then once I became a NED on other boards, both not-for-profits and commercial boards, I began to see the role of the NED and what they were trying to do differently. And it meant, I guess, some of the natural defensiveness or ego, I hope, came out of the way I was building my relationships with the board. So I had the privilege of serving on many boards and seeing many very accomplished chairs navigate their boards and get consensus. And that allowed me to really start to understand, well, how can I work better with my own board? How can I work more closely with the chair? And how can we work together to ensure that actually we build buy-in, we get appropriate challenge, we're able to build in new ideas into the plan and get a better product. So in some ways, I stopped trying to bring the finished product. I looked to think, well, how can I draw on the expertise around the board to make something better? How can I, expose some of the issues and challenges and things that we were debating as a management team, so that actually the NEDs felt they were part of something that they could co-create, as opposed to be used simply just to sign something off. And I think it was not so much a moment, but almost a process, as I sort of learned the role of a director, both as an executive director and a non-executive director. So it was over a period of time, I think.
Really interesting. That resonates a lot. One of the things I do as a CEO of this business is we run these quarterly pop-up boards where we bring a group of experts together on a specific topic and get them to challenge our thinking. And I sort of lay out, these are the options we're considering, these are the assumptions we're making, this is where I think we might be wrong, and this is where I'm thinking we should go, and then get them to critique it. And although I like to think of myself as a sort of low ego person who's sort of with a growth mindset, every time I feel that sense of fight or flight at some point when someone starts challenging things you've spent a lot of time as a CEO thinking about, and I have to keep reminding myself of that most favorite interpretation. They're here to help me stay open-minded. What do you, or did you do as a CEO to maintain that mindset once you'd been through that journey of having seen it through the eyes of a non-exec?
Well, I think what I learnt over a period of time is, it's important to have a close working relationship with the chair and understand and respect each other's roles. Ensure that you're working with a chair who trusts you and you trust them. You recognize we've each got a job to do. One of the first chairs I worked for was Christopher Bland. And he always used to say, I wasn't the CEO at the time. I was about to become the CEO during this transition. But something he said really resonated with me, which was, it's your job as the CEO to run the company, and it's his job as the chair to run the board. And if you work in partnership, you can, bring the best out of the wider board, the NEDs, etc., and you'll get a better outcome that way. So I think working with the chair and understanding and planning how to draw the best out of the debate, not being afraid of conflict, not being afraid of challenge, and not being defensive, I think is critical. And I think recognizing this, and I see this particularly now when I chair companies or charities or any sort of situation, working with people outside of the boardroom, I think is critical. The importance of the private sessions for non-executives before the board itself and after the board is really important. You as a chair, you're able to, in the pre-session, understand which things are on board members' minds, how you can focus the discussion. And in the debrief, sometimes you're able to bring out things that people didn't have a chance to say or felt uncomfortable talking about, so that actually you can debrief with the CEO later, or you can bring the paper back, if you like, if the debate wasn't properly really wasn't delivered in the way it should have been. So I think those are the things, just being very intentional about what you're trying to get out of the discussion and making sure that you do get that proper debate. There's the idea that conflict and challenge is a bad thing, but in my experience, and it took me a while to appreciate this, actually it isn't. The best boards I worked on had some pretty lively discussions, even arguments, even verbal fights, but ultimately, the issue was properly debated and litigated. And, some of the less effective boards, frankly, the CEO is expecting decisions just to be nodded through, and there's no value add from the board at all. As a non-executive, there's absolutely nothing worse than sitting through a board meeting where you're just being presented to and asked to say yes at the end. You want to be able to make a contribution. And as a CEO, I think it's really important that you create the room, the oxygen, the time to allow that discussion to happen. And to do that, I think you've got to tee up the issues. What are the points that you've been struggling with, and really draw on the experience of the room.
If you could go back in time as an independent chair or board member of any of the organizations where you served as a senior executive, are there moments where you give yourself or advice or input you didn't get at the time that you think would have unlocked significant value for the organization or avoided significant pain that might prove instructive for board members listening?
I reflect on this a lot. It's interesting. Once your executive career is finished, it does give you a lot of time to look back and think, what have I learned? What would I have done differently? And how can I share that experience with others in a way that's helpful? But To answer your specific question and to think of a specific example to it, it's probably the time we were negotiating a renewal of the undertakings, which was a set of legal and regulatory agreements we had with Ofcom around how BT operated and served the broader market. And it came at a time when we were on a roll. We'd just completed the acquisition of EE. It had been approved through all the legal and regulatory challenges without any changes. It fitted beautifully from a strategic perspective, a business logic. And, there's a moment when, I was sort of sitting back and admiring the work. In reality, it created a situation where everybody else in the market suddenly became aligned against us, just at a point when they could, really leverage that because of we have to renew our obligations from an undertakings perspective. And we started these negotiations with Ofcom and we had the outline of an agreement. We delivered against our obligations. We wanted to make a few changes to make Reach a little bit more independent, but it wasn't a fundamental change. And what I missed at the time was something that, is often easy to ignore in situations, which is the two main people at Ofcom changed the CEO and the chair in quick succession. And one of the things I've learned is same data, different people, different outcome. And particularly at a senior level in organizations and particularly when politics are involved. And I continued to pursue the same argument, which was largely we've met our obligations. This is the legal situation. So, you can't force us to do anything. We'll do things voluntarily, but only if they're in the interests of our own shareholders. And what I failed to really understand was the wider public narrative that was beginning to build around the company, which was certainly being, our competitors were helping to create. And what I wish I'd thought about at the time and what would have been good to really get perspective on from someone is, well, actually, why don't you just take a step back? There is a bigger deal to be done here. Actually, by better understanding what, the new management team at Ofcom wanted, what our competitors wanted, and just spending a little bit more time thinking about how I could have constructed things differently, actually, we could have got to, I think, a better outcome faster. Now, as it turned out, it was a very attritional negotiation, often managed in the public domain, but ultimately the legal arguments were so strong that, we won the battle. But in some ways, I've sort of reflected and think we lost the war because, reputationally, it was quite painful, I think, for the company at the time. And we didn't really think about that external narrative sufficiently, I think. And we ended up actually in a place where I think we could have presented what we were going to do in a much more positive way, much more proactive way. We were committed to a further investment in fibre. And indeed, we announced that soon after the agreement with Ofcom, but it wasn't part of the negotiation. It's something they wanted us to do. It's something we wanted to do. We announced that we were going to do fibre to the premise to 10 million homes. But ultimately, that could have been part of the solution, and it wasn't. So I guess to answer your question, it would have been, if I was going back to talk to myself now based on everything I've learned, I would say, privately, just think about this. Is there another way of doing this that allows you to create a true win-win, as opposed to trying to, ultimately something that was going to be a win-lose? And there was, and, ultimately we got there, but it could have been, I think, a much more positive experience.
It's a really interesting example, and I imagine lots of board members listening will have faced or face at some point a similar situation where they have a sort of high-flying CEO who's convinced they're right, and as you say, probably is right in the specific situation, but there's a bigger picture to be aware of. How do you think is what do you think is the most effective way of going about unlocking that CEO?
I'd probably say a couple of things. I think as a CEO, you're surrounded by advice. You're surrounded by people telling you what they think you should do. You know, consultants, investment bankers, lawyers, media advisors.
None of them have been in the arena themselves offering advice.
And in truth, all of them have an agenda. And so when people talk about, being a CEO is a lonely job, it's not because you're not, it's because you're ultimately finding somebody who you can talk to and be completely open with, who's not conflicted in some way, is very hard. And, you have mentors that can help on that to some extent on this. But you really do need somebody who can say, well, look, is there another way of looking at this problem? NEDs can perform that role. They need to be invited in to some extent, but they also need to reach out and share their experience. And that's, often that's a risk for the NED. But that is the key. You've got to have somebody who can look at the problem without any personal stake in it, and indeed be able to help you reason through, is there a better way? And that's difficult. So much of your success and the impact you have as a CEO, there's a chunk of it's down to the decisions you take, but a lot of it is down to context and timing, and, essentially luck. And, you've got to take advantage of that, but you can't, if you begin to confuse your own brilliance with actually benefiting from a tailwind or a lucky intervention, you begin to lose touch with reality. And you also need to recognize that actually, if over a period of time, you'll have a few things that go for you and a few things that go against you. And that time was a particularly difficult time for BT. I'd certainly, the first 3-4 years had been a 6 series of decisions that had gone really well. And, if I needed to roll a 6, I always got a 6. But I knew deep down that I was probably riding my luck, and I was probably being given more credit than I really deserved. And there would be a moment where all that would turn. It turned for me relatively sharply, and then I just kept tripping over a succession of bad news, some of which, quite frankly, was predated me or was nothing to do with decisions I made. I just happened to be in the seat at the time. And that made life difficult at times. There's no question about that. And at the same time, there were quite significant changes that we were having to make to the board. We were changing our chair, who timed out. The CFO was retiring. So some of the key relationships that I'd built up over time, I needed to reform with new people. So it was a particularly challenging time.
When you look back at the board dynamic during that period, what do you see now that you didn't see at the time?
I guess I underinvested in building relationships with board members as the board changed in its composition. It's interesting, a previous CEO of BT had, I'd say, warned me or sort of given me some advice earlier in the year before, that he gave me 2 pieces of advice. In truth, I ignored both of them, and he was right on both. One of them was to take particular care in the changing of chair and the changing of CFO, and make sure that I got the people that I wanted as much as I could influence that. And the other was think about your negotiating team with Ofcom, and have you got the right team on the pitch, sort of thing. And I didn't take them seriously enough at the time. And as I've reflected on it, and I've told him this since, he was right on both counts. And it sort of goes to another point that I've often reflected on. Often incoming CEOs, they they sort of skirt over the insights and experience of those who've done the job before. Everybody thinks it's going to be different for them, and everybody looks at the decisions that were made in the past and thinks, okay, I could be better at it, or it's going to be different for me. And in reality, there's a lot you can learn by truly being curious about why decisions were made in the past and what that individual learned. So I certainly in all my work with CEOs now, my mentoring, working with boards, I really encourage that process of learning from the past, why decisions were made and what was the context for making them. And so that actually that institutional knowledge is not lost. You may make the same decision ultimately, but you make it from a much more informed perspective. And it was this experience I had with, one of the previous CEOs of BT that really taught me that.
A single paid board role typically attracts over 30 applications, and many of those come from people with similar or greater experience than you. A CEO going for their first NED role may be up against 30 other CEOs. Seniority alone won't get you through. You need a board proposition that genuinely stands out. The Enter the Boardroom community helps you build one and then gives you the network and access to put it in front of the right people. Visit etb.newroll.com to find out more. The circumstances of your departure were public. You and the board had agreed on a strategy. The shareholders had not. Jan du Plessis' statement said the board is fully supportive of the strategy, but that a change of leadership was needed to deliver it. You've described the episode as brutal. Was the brutality in the process itself and how the board handled it, or was it something else entirely?
I mean, it felt very brutal to go through it. The context was we'd come out of this Ofcom review. We'd had a strategy refresh. We'd had a change of chair. Mike Rake, who'd appointed me, who I was very close to, had retired, and Jan du Plessis had taken over, and I was working closely with Jan. And we set a new direction. And just to clarify, shareholders agreed with it. It wasn't a question of shareholders wanted something different. And indeed, there was no real desire to move me out of the job, actually. We knew only one of the top 20 shareholders wanted a change. So it wasn't really shareholder driven as such. I guess, this is always one of those sort of jeopardy moments for a CEO when the chair changes. Ultimately, you're not necessarily that chair's pick, and you have to establish a relationship. And Jan and I were working fine, but I confessed that I wasn't going to be there for the long term. I was 5 years into the job. I was tired. I'd gone from this sort of hero to zero, if you like, or I was pretty battered in the press for a few months, and I felt as though I was ready for a new challenge. And he asked me to stay for a 4-year period, and I was not ready to do that. And we didn't change anything immediately at that point, but I think he probably decided at some point that actually he wasn't sure I was committed to the cause, and this was. It was a sort of 3 to 5 year investment, and he wanted somebody to rely on through that. So the nature of the change was very public, as you say. We launched the new strategy. It involved a significant investment in fiber. It meant that our short-term guidance was going to come down. The share price initially took a bit of a hit for that, and so there was a bit of noise around it. Jan, to his credit, gave me very public backing, not once, but twice, which made me at times feel a little bit like a football manager being given a vote of confidence by a chair. And so we as I say, we announced the strategy, we started delivering on it, but there was still too much noise, I think, for his liking around the company. The headlines were still, more negative than he liked. And then he decided one weekend that actually, look, it was time for a change. He, felt the strategy was right, but he wondered whether I had the conviction and the energy to really execute it. And that was on a Monday morning, and by Friday I was gone. And it was brutal in a sense. I'd gone from being high profile and probably getting more credit than I deserved, as I said earlier, to suddenly being out on the streets. And I sort of agreed to it very quickly because it was at a time when two of my children were doing public exams, A-levels, GCSEs, and there was just one day that they wouldn't have to face all the headlines because they didn't have exams, and that was the Friday. So I just had enough at this point, so just said, fine. But it took me a long time to really process it, probably a couple of years, because ultimately there was no successor ready. So having asked me to leave, he said, would you stay until I find a successor? So I ended up staying for another 10 months. And we delivered on the strategy. The share price went up 30% to, I think, £2.70. And it was all as though nothing had happened for a while. But it really affected me, and it affected my relationships with my family and my friends. And it took me a while to recover from it. There was one headline that was particularly painful, which had a photo of me outside Downing Street, which I'd been for some sort of government meeting, and it was from Downing Street to Down and Out, and that happened the sort of day after my departure was announced, and it was the time when I was taking one of my kids to the Jingle Bell Ball, so it was extremely that's what I mean when I said it was public and brutal. You just have to smile through that.
The press are merciless, and they sort of forget that there are humans on the other side of those headlines. What would you have wanted from the board that you didn't get?
I guess for me, it's what you really want is that if you're going to back me or you're going to back a CEO, you're given time to execute. So if there was a time that they wanted a change of leadership, I think it should have been as we were developing the strategy. But then having developed the strategy, agreeing it as a board, announcing it publicly, announcing a public backing of a CEO, and then through, no executional mistake, asking him to leave 3 or 4 weeks later, is in my view is not the way to handle it. If the facts change, fair enough. But this was all, public noise, if you like, and that's I think the right thing to do is boards need to be able to weather that. I don't expect them, if something changes, the plan doesn't get executed, it doesn't deliver, fair enough. But you've got to be given time to execute it. And so, Jan is a very accomplished chair, and it's no criticism of him, but he would say to me, I'll back you until I don't, which is, I think it's not the way I would do it. It's like, I'll back you. This is the time frame, and this is the context for backing you. And, I'm with you as we have to sort of weather the challenges, and it's not open-ended, but it is given some sort of air covers, if you like. And that's certainly the way I prefer to do it.
Really interesting echoes of Sir Nigel Rudd in episode 84, who was famous for his "I'll back you till I sack you." So it sounds like you don't think that is the right approach. It should be more, I'll back you as long as you are meeting these performance criteria over this time period.
Yeah. And there's an understanding that it's a bumpy road and that you're in it together. But there's a clear time frame that you're able to execute the strategy that you've agreed, and it's not weeks. It should be a year. Frankly, it should be 3 years, but a year is not unreasonable.
You talked about the advice you got to play a role in who comes in as chair. What specifically would you advise a CEO listening to this to do that you didn't?
It's the change of chair is a very tricky one for a CEO. They do not. No CEO gets to choose the chair. It's the decision of the board. You're fortunate as a CEO, you play a role in that, and your interests are taken into account. But do not overstep your mark and and necessarily have a strong preference, because it isn't a decision you can ultimately make. So I think it's, you need to be able to influence, but being too definitive of who you want and who you don't want is not a good idea, because ultimately that might go against you. And if you end up with a CEO, or if you end up with a chair who you didn't necessarily want, and I'm talking hypothetically here, by the way, not specifically, then ultimately that does not, put you in a very good situation when the new chair comes on board.
It's interesting. Funny enough, we host these chair masterminds where we bring chairs together in groups of 6 to 8 and they share challenges they're wrestling with. And we were hosting one of these the other day, and a chair was talking about exactly this scenario and whether or not they should give the CEO a veto over the appointment of the chair. And there was a mix in the room, but I think in this particular case, they felt like the CEO was so strong and so good that they wouldn't want to upset them by not allowing them to have that veto over the chair. They couldn't choose them, but they could have a veto. If they said, look, I cannot work with this person, they would not impose that chair because it would be too disruptive to lose the CEO and the chair at the same time. So I feel like as a CEO, you probably in some circumstances can at least have a veto. Would that be fair, or do you see it differently?
I think the term veto is such a loaded one, and it conveys an ultimate decision-making.
So I'm talking in practice rather than legally. Clearly, the board is the decision maker.
I wasn't suggesting from a legal perspective, but even in a non-legal way, I certainly would. If I'm appointing a CEO, I take, or I'm if on a board appointing a chair, I take the CEO's opinion and views seriously, but I try not to put it in such distinctive terms that at any point they can have a veto. I mean, if they can't work with the individual, it becomes clear, but labeling that as a veto, I think is dangerous personally, because it conveys power to the CEO that frankly they shouldn't have.
So I fully get that from a chair or a board member's perspective, but if you're sitting there listening to this as a CEO, trying to your point, influence the appointment, is that the direction of travel you should be aiming for to make sure that you are at least comfortable with whoever it is? And if you're not, making it very clear that you're not.
That's a much better way of framing it, in my opinion. And it goes, as we talked about earlier in the podcast, I probably did not spend enough time really on that process when I was CEO of BT. I had so many other things on my plate that I didn't engage sufficiently in the process of picking the chair.
So does that mean things like, interviewing them, referencing them, speaking with people who'd worked with them before? What else would you encourage a CEO to do? What's the time?
The thing I've learned about these senior appointments, both as executives and non-executives, is largely from my experience of now working with private equity. Private equity appointments involve spending a lot more time with the individual in different circumstances to really understand their motivations, to really understand how they perform under pressure, to really understand, where their strengths and weaknesses lie, which a typical interviewing process doesn't always reveal, and particularly for these senior jobs, people are pretty accomplished at being interviewed, so they don't necessarily reveal these sorts of things as easily. I find it's critically important to talk to the people who worked with the individual in the past and understand, if you want to call it that, the informal references, because that's where you learn actually what it is like to work with that individual. And, is there an aspect of the way they work that wouldn't work well with you?
If a chair listening to this finds themselves in a situation where they need to move a CEO on, what's your advice to them on how best to go about that?
You need to give the individual a chance. So to really establish up front what does success look like, and, what it takes to continue to work together and to stay in the role, even if they've been in a role for a while. And then if there is a change, I think you have to do it, frankly, the more you can do it with allowing the person to have a sense of dignity and respect, the better. We're all human at the end of the day. And, there were ways of asking somebody to leave that allows them to keep just a little self-respect and protects their self-esteem a little bit. It's not necessarily an opportunity to publicly humiliate somebody. And because those sorts of things always come back to bite. So I think, just treat people as human beings, treat people the way you'd like to be treated yourself, ultimately. And so having an early conversation and trying to get to a position where ultimately both parties agree it's the right thing to do to make a change. In most situations, I would suggest actually a frank conversation, maybe over, might take 2 or 3 occasions to really talk it through, but ultimately you can get to that place. I think doing something suddenly and unexpected is not really the way to do it.
Gavin, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to ask you a quick question and ask you for a short answer if you're ready.
Very good.
Best book every board member should read, and why?
The Effective Executive by Peter Drucker. Drucker's principles and observations, I think, can be applied to any business, and they're timeless.
What's the question boards consistently fail to ask, and what would change if they did?
What would have to be true for our strategy to fail? So it's just before you push the button and say, we're going to do this, actually everybody taking themselves out of the convergence of opinion and saying, okay, what would have to be true if our strategy were to fail? And ensuring that you can mitigate those circumstances.
What's a boardroom myth you think needs busting?
I've learnt this through experience. People say, governance slows us down. It's poor governance slows us down, in my experience. But good governance protects the interests of all shareholders, all stakeholders, if you like, over the long term.
Favourite quote?
Well, I have to go back to Drucker, don't I? Management is doing things right, and leadership is doing the right things. And I've always believed that actually as an executive, you need to be in periods where you're a leader, and there are periods where you need to be a manager.
Piece of board advice that sounds right, but is wrong.
The best boards I've been on are ones where there's been, quite frankly, there's been a proper debate and a good argument. And people have been prepared to have a contrarian view and raise it at the board. So conflict is a bad thing. When people say conflict is a bad thing at boards, I actually think that's wrong.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time, and how's that changed how you behave?
I think it probably goes back to the first question we talked about. I initially, when I became a CEO, I saw my job was to get agreement from the board to come with a complete plan that they couldn't find an issue in. I've learnt over time that actually bringing something that's partly baked, if you like, is clear, has a point of view, but does properly flush out the choices and the alternatives and the issues is a better way to get a better decision and to get better buy-in from boards.
Best interview question to ask a prospective non-executive?
Give me an example of when you've challenged or raised a challenge at a board that often went against the CEO, maybe, or went against the chair, and you asked a provocative question, and what was the context, and what happened. I want lively, engaged board members, not people sort of sitting there and wondering what they're going to have for dinner.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
They're usually people issues, I think. And these are tricky. As I've sort of articulated earlier, you want to give people a chance, and you've got to give them time. And if you make a decision to back somebody, but if it's not working, you need to make an intervention. So getting that framework right is key. What are the rules of engagement, but at what point do you intervene, and how can you make a change quickly, but as painless as possible.
And finally, one thing our listeners should take away from this episode, if they take nothing else.
I think for me, it's probably how do you get the best value out of boards? They're there ultimately to represent the needs of shareholders. You need to respect what their role is and learn as a CEO how to get the most out of the value that they can bring, the experience they've got. Many of them have been in your position or seen these situations before. And you've got to get into the right mindset of actually that is an advantage. That is something that can help you as a CEO, as opposed to, it being a chore that you're going to have to go and present to them once a quarter.
Gavin, thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.
My pleasure.
Gavin, if you've still got time, can we take five minutes just to do the community questions at the end, or just whip through them?
Yeah, go ahead.
So these are a series of questions that come from our Enter the Boardroom community members. Question from Sophie Wright. What would be your top 3 recommendations to board directors to help them lead effectively through uncertainty, disruptive change, and geo and economic crisis?
Ooh.
Nice, easy one.
Well, it won't be any surprise. It's try to stick to first principles as much as possible. What is the purpose of the business? Who are your customers? How do we make their lives better? Where should we be playing and what it takes to win? That to me is timeless. You need to judge it in the context of what's going on in the world and geopolitical issues, but you've always got to come back to the first principles of why we're in business. What's our right to play? So I think the second thing is around relevance, which we touched on. I think the half-life of, experiences that you bring to boards is getting shorter. I think it is your duty as a non-exec to be up to date with how particularly technology is changing the way people work and live and go about their lives. And you can't just expect the company just to brief you on that. You need to be curious yourself. And that means reading, learning, working with other people to make sure you've got something valuable to bring. And then the last thing is try to listen more than speak. It's probably the last thing I would say. Good board directors don't tell CEOs what to do. They ask questions that draw out better conclusions. And that's a real art. And I've been on boards where people just essentially, try and tell the CEO what to do or express very strong views, as opposed to try and provide provocative questions or relevant examples for consideration.
Gavin, that has been phenomenal. Thank you so much for taking the time to share all of your experience and wisdom. If you want to compete for paid board roles, not just apply and hope, the Enter the Boardroom community gives you the positioning, skills, and access to do it properly. Listeners get 10% off. Visit etb.newroll.com and use the code ENTER at checkout.